This is where I think it's really important for people to see where their leads are coming from, to be able to see what is working and double down on that. Don't allow yourself to get distracted by the sponsorships, to get distracted by the things that people are telling you to do online or their 5-step formula to a 6-figure business, because most of the time what they're trying to sell you or what they're trying to teach you is a one size fits all. And that's not how business works. And that's not how a podcast is going to work either. Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. Today, we're going to talk about how much money can you actually make with your podcast. Now, we have had quite a few episodes where we have talked about monetizing your podcast. We have episode 11, how to use dynamic content to make money with your podcast. We have episode 26, how to monetize any podcast. That episode is really good if you are looking for different ways to monetize your podcast. You're not really sure how to do that. On this podcast, we usually talk about monetizing your podcast by selling your own products and services. You can find out more about that on episode 29, which is called How to Monetize Your Podcast by Selling Your Own Services and Products. But going back to episode 26, that one is monetizing any podcast. So it's all the other ways minus your own services and products. And in that episode, we talked about the fact that the majority of podcasters do not make money with their podcasts. They are not monetizing it. They are not getting enough downloads in order to make money with it. So I want to kind of give you some stats, get you some information about how much money you can actually make with your podcast. Now, this is not to throw any shade at the podcasters who are using sponsorships to monetize their podcast. But usually on the internet, if you Google how to monetize a podcast, how to make money with your podcast, you will see people talk about sponsorships specifically. And you'll see people like Pat Flynn. He's an incredible person. I've heard incredible things about him. I used to listen to his podcast back in 2017-18, and I actually don't listen to a lot of podcasts now because I like to make sure I focus and stay in my own kind of sphere of information, and that I'm not pulling from other people's information and other people's content to create my own content. So you'll see if you listen to him, you know, he made $18,000 in a month from sponsorships for his podcast. Granted, his podcast has millions of downloads. He has thousands of people who follow him. He probably has thousands of people on his email list. There's a lot that goes into the sponsorships than just, oh, I have 5 people listening. Great, I'm going to make $18,000. It's not really how it works. You'll also see other people who shall not be named because we don't need to promote them, who will talk about how much money they make and how great it is. And most of the time, those people actually have such large audiences that they require their guests to pay to be on their show, which if you listen to my show and you are like me, then that probably doesn't feel authentic to your audience. It doesn't feel right or good. There's a lot of noise on the internet and a lot of people saying sponsorships, have your guests pay to be on your show. All these different things that you can do to monetize your podcast and make tons of money. But let's talk practical real quick. I had someone listening to my podcast over the course of about 3 months. So that is 12, let's just say it's 12 episodes that they listened to. Then they hopped on a call with me, decided to work with me, and we worked together for 3 months. That is the minimum that I have people work with me. So we worked together for 3 months. Her client value was $6,000 over the course of her time working with me, which means that of the 12 episodes she listened to, so if we just take the $6,000 that we made, divided by the 12 episodes that she listened to, it's about $500 per episode. So I can approach my podcast in a way that is like, okay, if I can create quality content and talk to my ideal customers and get them and convert them into paying clients through my podcast, then that means I'm making money from my podcast. So I take it that way, and I strategically use my podcast in that way to ensure that if you don't want to pay to work with us, great. If you want to join our membership, which we are launching shortly, like woohoo. Actually, by the time this goes live, we will have launched our membership. So if you want to join the membership for $35 a month and get access to me, co-working time, you'll see the ad for that in the end, all that stuff. It's very exciting. I'm excited about it. It's going to be incredible. So that would be a $35 per person per month conversion if they are a listener. But looking at this person who wants to work with us one-on-one, who wants to pay for full service, then the money that we'll get from them is obviously going to convert a lot higher per episode. But that's how I can look at it. I can look at it as this episode, I was able to make this amount of money from that episode because this person who ended up working with me paid me X amount of dollars. Now, you might not always know who comes where. If someone books a strategy session, they might just say, oh, I'm a podcast listener. They could have been listening from the very beginning, right? But if we frame it and frame our podcast and our content that we're creating in a way that makes sense, so we kind of look at the numbers, which my brain works in numbers and analytics and statistics and all that stuff. So that's how I like to see things. But you could just look at it as this person listened to 12 episodes and I was able to convert them. Awesome. So the typical person who listens to my podcast takes about 12 episodes to convert. So let me make sure that these next batch of 12 is geared towards ensuring that I take someone on a journey through that sales process where they feel comfortable that by the time they get on the phone, they are fangirling over me, they are excited to work with me, and they already are ready to pay. Let's take another example. So say I only have my membership and I get 20 listeners in from my membership. And they specifically said that they came from my podcast and they continue with me for 3 months. Now, you might not be able to quantify it like how I did where the person said that they had been listening for 3 months, but I can say over the next 3 months, I am making $2,100 from my podcast because I was able to convert those people from my podcast listenership into my membership. And so you can kind of format it that way. So this is where I think it's really important for people to see where their leads are coming from. Now, there's really easy ways to do that. You can have an intake form. You can have a conversation with the person when they hop on, whatever it is that's going to work best for you to be able to track that information. But I think that it's such a great way to be able to see where are your leads coming from, what is working, and double down on that. If something is working, then don't allow yourself to get distracted by the sponsorships, to get distracted by the things that people are telling you to do online or their 5-step formula to a 6-figure business, because most of the time what they're trying to sell you or what they're trying to teach you is a one size fits all. And that's not how business works at all. And that's not how a podcast is going to work either. So if we're talking specifically about podcasting, which we should, because let's get back to podcasts, right? I'll get off my soapbox for a second. When you have those numbers, it allows you to be more excited about creating content for your podcast. We talked a couple episodes about going deeper with your content instead of going wider. And this is where I think that it's going to work really, really well, because you can see what is working for people, where your stats are telling you that people are listening to these episodes, people are interested in this content, and then double down on that and use that to be able to make money from your podcast in a way that feels good. Being able to educate your audience, give them so much value that by the time they hop on the phone with you, they are ready to hand over their cards. So, how much money can you make with your podcast? My answer to that is it depends. But the sky is the limit. There is no right or wrong answer here. I could convert one person for a $300 strategy session, and that's still awesome. To me, it's not really about how much money I'm making from my podcast. Yes, that's an important aspect, and that is something that I do try to quantify. But it's more about being able to connect with my audience, being able to educate them and give them the value that they need in order to have a successful podcast. Because ultimately, my goal and my values surround my desire to see people's voices spoken. And yes, I need to be able to make money to support my family. That also is a value. But one of the values is also being able to allow people's voices to be heard and to be spoken. So I talked about this on a podcast episode where I was a guest with Emily Aborn on the She Built This podcast. So I will link that in the show notes. You can go listen to my interview over there if you would like. And we were talking about the online business space and just things that we can get distracted with very easily. And one of those things that I do get distracted with is when I see someone creating something that I ultimately think I could do this better. And sure, I could. I definitely could do something better. But it goes back to, where are my values? Where does this actually stand in my business? Where does this actually make sense? And can I use this to further my values and further my goals within my business? And so creating that thing was not going to do it. And what I did instead was I looked at, how can I use that energy and that need to create that thing in the industry and use it within my personal business framework. I thought, okay, well, I want to be able to create value and free content for my audience. So this is actually going to be a revised podcast launch training. Okay, perfect. So instead of creating a podcast launch course, which I have no need to do right now, I have absolutely no business doing that right now. I have a million things on my plate and there's no room for that. But I can still create something that is going to bring value to my audience. I was saying all this to say that when you look at how much money you can make from your podcast, it's important to go back to your values. It's important to go back to the things that are driving you, the things that are your driving force. And if your podcast is a hobby, awesome, incredible. Don't let the money and how much money you can make from your podcast distract you from doing something you love and doing something that is bringing you joy, bringing your audience joy, bringing joy to the world. So that is all I really have to say about this. So how much money can you make from your podcast? It can range from $2,000 to $300 to, if you're Pat Flynn, $18,000. But it really has to be aligned with what you want your podcast to look like, aligned with what your monetary goals are. And if your podcast isn't doing it, then there are ways that you can strategically use your podcast to make money. But there are also other avenues that you can take. We're not going to talk about those on this podcast because this is a podcast about podcasting. But there are other ways that you can make money within your business. If you're looking for ideas, there are plenty of business coaches out there and people that you can go to. If you need recommendations, I can always send you to the right people because I'm very picky about the business coaches that I listen to. All right. Now, I hope this wasn't discouraging because it might feel a little discouraging, and I'm sorry for that. That was not my intent. My intent was to be realistic with this and to be able to share with you my experiences as well as some of the experiences that we've seen. I mean, we have talked to Sam and Karen of Making Website Magic, where they were able to take a few people and that's all they needed. They only needed 5 to 7 people within their group program. All of them were converted through their podcast, and that is how they're making their money. So obviously it works, and there are ways to make a ton of money from your podcast just beyond sponsorships and being able to use your podcast as a lead generating machine. So don't be discouraged. I promise that it does work. There are ways to use your podcast to make money, but I wanted to kind of set that expectation here today. All right, have a fantastic rest of your week, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.